Before you begin today's lesson on figurative language, symbolism, and imagery, you need to make sure that you have read Hills Like White Elephants by Ernest Hemingway. This is the text that we are going to be diving deeper into towards the second half of this video. So what is figurative language? It is language that is intended to create an image, association, or other effect in the mind of the reader that goes beyond the literal meaning or expected use of the words involved. So what that means is an author might say one thing, but they actually mean something deeper. You have to dig down and see what the deeper meaning of what they said is. And they do this because they're trying to paint an image in your mind and trying to convey a more complex idea for you by painting a picture in your mind. So for this reason, the word figurative is often thought as a meaning beyond the literal, which refers to the strict meaning of words. Some examples are right here. We have the literal meaning of it stinks means it smells bad, but the figurative meaning of it stinks would be it's terrible. Okay, so it's where it's going beyond the literal meaning and attaching another meaning to that. So figurative language uses figures of speech to create these images in the reader's mind. Some of these you might be familiar with already, such as simile, symbolism, metaphor, but others you might not be as familiar with. We will be covering each of these and breaking them down with the slides. All right, the first one I want to hit on because it's extremely important is symbolism. Symbolism is what we're going to really be diving into as we analyze Hills Like White Elephants. It's an idea in which an author uses a symbol to represent a meaning, idea, or quality of something or someone beyond the literal. So, like I said, Hills Like White Elephants is full of symbols that we will talk about more. A symbol is an object, word, or image that has a deeper significance than just its literal meaning. It represents something more than itself. So some examples of symbolism, we have traditional symbols that, culturally speaking, most people know what these represent. So a cross is the Christian symbol of faith in Jesus. The red rose or heart represents love. The dove or olive branch symbolizes peace. And then countries' flags represent the nation and national pride. Some examples of symbolism in literature are the Harry Potter series. Harry's scar is symbolic of his bravery. He wears it like a badge of honor. In the Scarlet Letter, the letter A that Hester Prynne has to wear is a symbol of her adultery. And the short story we read earlier in this class, King of the Bingo Game, the button for the bingo wheel represents hope, fate, and a sense of control. In the short story, The Yellow Wallpaper, which we've also read, the wallpaper is symbolic of society repressing women, and the woman in the wallpaper is symbolic of the narrator and American women of the time period. Next up, we have allegory. So an allegory is a symbolic device. It builds off of symbolism in which characters or events in a story represent or symbolize ideas and concepts. So essentially the whole story is a symbol for something else. So right here, this is an image from the children's book, Yertle the Turtle by Dr. Seuss. This entire story is an allegory. And it symbolizes Nazi Germany and Hitler's rise to power. You'll see that Yertle the turtle, who's on the top, uses the other turtles in order to get a better view of the pond. And so that is symbolic of how Hitler used other people in order to gain power. Because this entire story is a symbol and all the characters represent different people in real life, and the whole thing represents a historical event, it is an allegory. Next up, we have irony, and there are 3 different types of irony, so it's not going to be enough just to say that an author uses irony. We have to examine what kind of irony they actually use. So a what irony is a contrast between what is expected and what actually happens. We are probably most familiar with verbal irony because it closely aligns with sarcasm. There are a lot of similarities between the two, and you could almost say that they're kind of like siblings, though the proper academic term would be verbal irony instead of sarcasm. Here we have the example from the author Lemony Snicket. Today was a very cold and bitter day, as cold and bitter as a cup of hot chocolate, if the cup of hot chocolate had vinegar added to it and were placed in a refrigerator for several hours. Okay, so right here, this line, as cold and bitter as a cup of hot chocolate, that is verbal irony, because in reality, we know that hot chocolate is warm and tastes good. But then he goes on to explain his use of verbal irony, because what he really means is it was a nasty, bitter day. Next, we're going to talk about situational irony. We'll encounter this in the text that we read as well. This is when something happens that we wouldn't expect to happen. An example here is from the Yellow Wallpaper. So in that short story, the narrator's husband is a physician, but the narrator says, "Perhaps that is one reason I do not get well faster." And so this is situational irony, because although her husband is a doctor, he should be providing healing. She is saying that is actually the reason why she does not get better faster, because he thinks he knows what's best and the best practices for healing her postpartum depression. Then we also have dramatic irony. So dramatic irony occurs when we as the reader know something that the characters do not know. This could be something that one character doesn't know, or something that all of the characters do not know. An example of this is from Romeo and Juliet. Romeo kills himself because he thinks Juliet is dead, but the reader knows she is only in a temporary sleeping state. So that's dramatic irony, because we know she's not actually dead, but that's the reason that Romeo kills himself, is because he believes something else. Next up, we're going to talk about similes. This is a figure of speech in which the author compares two unlike things using the word like or as. So those words are going to be key into indicating similes. Not every sentence that has the word like or as is a simile, but these are good signals. So some examples are, this cot is as comfortable as a bed of nails. By comparing the cot to a bed of nails, it's letting the reader know that it is actually very uncomfortable. We also have an example from Romeo and Juliet. Is love a tender thing? Is it too rough, too rude, too boisterous? And it pricks like thorn. So right there, that is awesome example of figurative language, and it's showing us that love hurts like a thorn on a rose. Next up, our example from Hills Like White Elephants. The title of this short story itself is a simile, because it's comparing the hills to white elephants. All right, I was trying. I said, the mountain looked like white elephants. Wasn't that bright? So right there, she is comparing the hills that she's seeing, Jig to the white elephants, to show some different things. We're actually going to hold off on diving too deep into this simile, because we're going to get to it in a little bit. Next up, this is from Seinfeld, the TV show. The sea was angry that day, my friend, like an old man trying to send back soup to the deli, or soup in a deli. So right there, that is showing that that old man would be very angry, and that's showing that the sea was very rough and difficult that day. Metaphor is like a simile. They're very closely related. You would probably call them siblings as well. It's a figure of speech that compares two unlike things, so that's the same as a simile, but it does it without using the word like or as. And we have some examples here. The rain on my car is a baptism. That's saying that it's raining really hard. Hell is a teenage girl. It's showing a comparison to hell and teenage girls, because commonly teenage girls can be known to be a little bit crazy and emotional. Love is a battlefield, showing that love is difficult. And then the last one from Lord of the Flies. The sun in the west was a drop of burning gold that slid near and nearer the sill of the world. So that's using figurative language in order to describe the sunset. The last figurative language literary device we're going to talk about is personification. So writers use personification to give human characteristics such as emotions and behaviors to non-human things, animals, and ideas. The first example, my alarm yelled at me this morning. It's giving the alarm the ability to yell like a human to show that it was very loud, noisy, obnoxious. Can you see the star winking at you? So the star is not actually going to wink, but it's going to flicker. It's personifying it, the star to show us that. The next quote is from The Giving Tree. Once there was a tree, and she loved a little boy. So it's giving the tree the ability, human ability to love. And then you'll see we've already talked about this example once. Not only is it a simile, it is also an example of personification. The sea was angry that day. So seas cannot actually be angry, have those emotions. It is giving it human emotions. As always, before we dive too much deeper into our text, we're going to learn a little bit about our author. Ernest Hemingway grew up in an upscale Chicago suburb, but spent his summers on Lake Walloon in northern Michigan. His physician father spent quality time with him hunting and fishing. His parents forbid him from enlisting and was uninterested in college. So he worked as a reporter for the Kansas City Star before volunteering as a Red Cross ambulance driver. After being badly wounded on the Italian front, he returned to journalism stateside. In 1921, he moved to France, where he gained literary traction, writing amongst other well-known American authors. He served as a war correspondent in World War II, surviving 2 plane crashes and 4 marriages. Depression and various physical ailments led him to commit suicide before his 62nd birthday. In addition to knowing the author, it's really important that we know the time, because the time period in which a text is written is going to reveal a lot about that story for us. So Hills Like White Elephants was written in 1927, which was when 15,000 American women a year died from underground illegal abortions. Nearly 50 years before abortion was legalized in the United States. Nearly 50 years before doctors realized alcohol was bad for pregnancy. And only 7 years after women received the right to vote in the United States. Now that you've read the story and have some background information about the author and the time period in which it is written, I want you to go ahead and pause the video and answer these 5 questions. This is going to test your knowledge of reading the text. I will be going over these questions, but I want you first to pause and try to jot the answers to these questions in your notes, map out what you already know and understand about this story. So hopefully you paused and made some notes on these 5 questions, but let's go ahead and go over it. The narrator of our story it's told from third-person objective point of view. So this point of view is where the narrator and us, the readers, are a fly on the wall. Okay, we don't know the thoughts and emotions of either of the characters in this story except through their conversation. So we're kind of eavesdropping in on their conversation, and then we have to infer to pick up on their thoughts, their emotions, and their feelings about the issue being discussed. We have 2 main characters in the story. There is a bartender as well, but that's just a non-essential plot point. Okay. The 2 main characters that we have in this story are the American man and Jig. The American man is sometimes referred to just as the man, and Jig is sometimes referred to as just the girl. Okay, so these 2 characters throughout the story are having a very important conversation, and this conversation is taking place at a train station. We know the train station is in Barcelona, and the time period we can assume is around the time period in which the text was written is the 1920s. This setting is really important because what they are talking about, the operation that they're talking about, is something that was illegal during this time period, And then also the location of the train station is important because they're waiting there at the train station bar, trying to decide where they will go, where their future will lie, what decision they will make about the operation, what the next step in their journey together is. So they haven't necessarily picked a destination yet. The conflict of the story. So this story is rooted around a conflict. And Hemingway never directly states what the conflict is. The characters hint around it. They're dancing around it in this conversation. But the conflict is an operation. And hopefully you were able to infer that this operation that they're talking about is an abortion. So the American man has gotten Jig pregnant, and they don't necessarily have a stable relationship. He doesn't want this baby, and Jig is unsure about whether or not she should have the operation. So he's all for the operation, and he's trying to convince her that this is the best idea for their relationship. At the end of the story, we don't have a true solution to this problem. The American man begins to head towards the platform. He leaves the bar and the train station, and Jig remains there. And that's going to play an essential role that we'll talk about in just a bit. But there's no true solution to the story. We don't know how it ends. Hemingway leaves the readers on a cliffhanger so that we have to decide and interpret the text in order to figure out what we think happens next. Hills Like White Elephants is rich in figurative language because, like I discussed earlier, the title itself is an example of figurative language. It's an example of a simile. So Jig describes the hills as being like white elephants, and there's multiple layers to analyzing this. First off, you can look at it as a simile. As she is comparing, Jig is comparing two unlike things using the word like or as. She is comparing hills to white elephants. And in order to really understand this, we have to understand the idiom. That's another type of figurative language of what white elephants are. And so she's not saying that they actually look like white elephants. She's using the idiom white elephants as a reference of the elephant in the room. So this becomes a symbol as well. And what the elephant in the room is, it's something awkward that nobody wants to talk about. So in this story, the elephant in the room is going to be the baby that Jig and the American man are discussing whether or not should be aborted. This is also a reference to a white elephant gift, symbolic of that. And so what a white elephant gift is, it also has a negative connotation. It's a gift that nobody really actually wants. You might have gone to a white elephant Christmas party where we give each other kind of humorous gifts or something that nobody actually wants to have in their home or needs. So this is symbolic of the baby as well. Because it is that awkward gift that has been bestowed upon them that the American man definitely doesn't want, and Jig is trying to decide whether or not she wants to have. The next symbol that we have would be the drinks. And so I wanted to point out in the notes about the time period that this is 50 years before people knew that alcohol was bad for pregnant women. So it's not like they are drinking in order to harm the baby. You have to understand the time period. They did not know that it was bad. So as they're having this difficult conversation about the operation, the abortion, they are also ordering drinks, and it's the American man who's ordering the drinks really at this bar in the train station. And so oftentimes the conversation you'll see in the story switches from talking about the issue at hand, the white elephant in the room, the abortion, to talking about the drinks. So they serve as a distraction from the real issue that's needing to be discussed. So next up, the hills also serve as a symbol. So in the story, here's a couple quotes that are going to be important. These are actually from the text. I'm reading snippets from it. So the girl was looking off at the line of hills. They were white in the sun, and the country was brown and dry. They're lovely hills. Okay, this is what Jiggs is saying about the hills. And then later, Hemingway goes on to write, they sat down at the table and the girl looked across at the hills on the dry side of the valley and the man looked at her and at the table. So Jig is distracted by these hills. She's constantly looking to them, reflecting of them. This is, the hill is symbolic of her pregnant belly. It's symbolic of the baby that is growing inside of her. And so she is looking at this endearingly, and she's enjoying the view. She's enjoying the experience. She keeps looking out there and looking essentially and thinking about her unborn baby. Whereas the American man is not interested in the hills at all. His interest is her, the table, the drinks, the conversation, and his interest lies in convincing her to have this operation. Lastly, the beaded curtain serves as a symbol in this text for a couple reasons. So it is a distraction to Jig. When she gets uncomfortable in the conversation and the American man starts to make her uncomfortable with the topic of the operation, she begins to play with it. So it serves as a distraction for her. And then it also is symbolic of the separation that lies between the two of them. They are on separate sides of this issue, so he brings in the conversation to an end. He walks off and heads towards the station platform, which is symbolic that he's made his decision and he's ready to go take the next step of the journey, whereas Jig stays at the bar room. She stays at the table, and so she is still on the other side of the beaded curtain, having not decided on what to do about the baby, whether to have the abortion or not. Now, I want you to take some time and really think through these discussion questions. This will take your analysis of the text a little bit deeper beyond what we've discussed in this video. These questions are going to be really essential for the future of this course. You may choose to write your essay on this short story, so these questions will help with that. But also, you will be quizzed and tested on this short story, so you want to make sure that you're making your understanding a little bit more solid. So there will not be a discussion board for you to complete, but still take some time to add to your notes, your thoughts, your answers to these questions. So the first one is, what role does gender play in the conflict of the story? Next, why is the American man referred to as the man while Jig is referred to as the girl? Where will the train take Jig and the American man? Where will the conversation take Jig and the American man? Will Jig get the abortion or not? What text evidence supports your prediction? Will the relationship between Jig and the American man survive this conflict? What text evidence supports your prediction? And then lastly, this question is really important as well. Why does Hemingway use the word operation and never the word abortion? So really take some time, at least 10-15 minutes, to think through these questions, add some notes on them in order to solidify your understanding of this text before you kind of close the door on your notes for today.